Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I am Tahir Dhindsa and you're watching SDTV. Sustainable Development Goals, 17 of them, are pivot on which up to next, say, 17 years or so, the world is hanging like it's hanging on the tenterhook. You achieve them or you don't achieve them. What is there that they say? The international rule-based system and energy to everything, climate change, seems to be related to that. That need investment, huge sort of investment in climate, in capacity building, in water, in sanitation, in gender parity, all those things. But what happens when a country is reeling under debt and the sword of the Damocles is hanging, what they call is a structural default? Pakistan is one country where we need probably all 17 of them. Climate change, women issue, child mortality, sanity, you name it. And the money is very scarce. It's not there. How to finance your agenda on sustainable development goals? We have an expert with us who has worked here in Pakistan on economic side and on monetary side and other things. And right now, he's working with the UN system, with UNESCAP. He's Director, Macroeconomic Policy and Financing for Development Division with SDGs. Hamza Ali Malik. Very warm welcome.
Thank you.
Please enlighten us at least on the level of that we establish a premise to talk further.
Excellent question, Tarway. Excellent question. This is the issue at the moment. A lot of countries, including Pakistan, want to increase investments to pursue sustainable development goals more effectively. But many of them are finding they don't have the resources. Adding insult to injury, the debt pressures have increased considerably more recently, especially since the impact of the pandemic. Very briefly speaking, pandemic led countries, or rather forced countries, to come out and support their businesses and individuals and the economy as a whole. So a large fiscal measures were introduced. A lot of spending was done by governments. As a consequence, the deficits in the region have increased. Pakistan again experienced the same thing, which is fine, which was needed. Another consequence for the pandemic was inflation went up, food inflation in particular. As a consequence, interest rates were increased, which is the direct cost of borrowing. So debt servicing costs have gone up. So last 3-4 years, these macro conditions have turned against the desire of countries to try and increase investments so they can pursue SDGs effectively. So it's extremely pertinent, timely, and as I said, the most pressing issue in my understanding. The interesting conversation is how to go about doing that, what to do with that. It seems like a paradox, right? You have high levels of debt, which makes it difficult for you to expand your fiscal investments further in SDGs. And on the other hand, you want to invest more in those SDGs. So how do you reconcile the two, right? The need to invest more when you don't have the resources. In fact, your existing resources are going towards dealing with the debt problem. So a multi-pronged strategies are needed over here. This is something in UNESCAP we have been working extensively with many countries in the region. We just had a session here at the conference also. We talked about some issues with Pakistan that can be pursued. So broadly speaking, two broad areas. One in the fiscal area, which are more immediate requirements. 3 categories there. One on the taxation side. It has been talked about, very well-known issues in Pakistan and in the region. What we call tax fairly and spend smart. Tax fairly means progressive taxation needs to be there. The capacity of the government to increase direct taxes has to increase.
And that too on the vertical axis.
Of course, right? So that's at the moment leaves much room for improvement, let's put it this way. So that's one area. And then within that, of course, there are many specific policy areas, but I'm not going to go into detail at the moment. If you ask, I can share some examples. Second is spending efficiently, spend smart. So use your available resources very effectively, very smart. There's a lot of technical studies, but a lot of developing countries, and Pakistan included, are not spending their money efficiently. For the same outcome in health and education and infrastructure development, we're spending 30% more to get the same outputs. So there's a need to be, attention need to be paid on how to go by improving things. Third area is debt management. Debt, whatever you have raised so far, the capacity to manage debt properly, there's again a lot of principles out there. There's a lot of room there to improve situation as well. So that's one pocket. Other is role of international community, where UN system and other multilateral organizations are working. So in the debt area, unfortunately, there is no agreed upon international debt resolution framework. The closest thing we have that came after the pandemic, the G20 Common Framework for Debt Treatment. It has many weaknesses. The only example, successful example of a country that has had debt restructuring under this framework is Zambia. That took about 2 years. So the process is very slow and it's not very effective at the moment. So a lot of room for improvement in there as well. So that's one area where a lot of work is going on in UN, including my team over here. So domestically, countries has to go on for a fiscal side. Internationally, we have to have a framework. Why we need that?
Debt relief.
For debt relief, exactly. So this is what I was sharing, for example, in the session. In 3 stages. So what are the 3 stages where we try to add nuances or research for policy insights? First stage, assessing debt. How do you know countries in serious debt distress? High level of debt is not necessarily problematic.
Countries like Pakistan, you don't need to know. It's right.
No, I tend to disagree. I don't think so. Pakistan debt is high. That's what I was sharing. Let me give you a simple example other than debt, other than Pakistan. So countries like Afghanistan, for instance, or many Pacific Island countries, Marshall Islands and few others, their debt GDP ratio is 20-25%. And they're deemed as high risk of debt distress. Countries like Japan or Singapore, Japan's debt GDP ratio is 260%. And yet they're rated perfectly top-notch, least debt risk averse. So level of debt on its own doesn't tell you much. There are a lot of details that need to be assessed, right? So first step is, how do you assess debt? How do you say this country's debt position is under stress? This level is high. How high is high? We have these broader notions of 60% of debt to GDP ratio. It's an irrelevant number.
Yeah, economy is productive and turn it into products and sell it or export. It's not.
आम लफ्जों में बात करें तो real issue is very simple. कि जो debt raise कर रहे हैं, spend कहाँ कर रहे हैं आप? बिल्कुल. At the end of the day, if you are spending in building the productive capacity, जैसा आपने कहा, of course, issuing debt is not going to raise problems. But if you are not, if you are consuming it at the end of the day, not creating any or not putting towards investment and creating any productive capacity, you're not going to go far. So the first stage is debt assessment. Uske andar we propose a new approach, how to have a long-term view. What it means is where you can explicitly incorporate countries' SDG investment requirements, country structural policies, and most importantly, is financing strategies within the assessment framework before coming to the point debt is sustainable or not. That's number one. Number two is, let's say country is already deemed under facing high level of debt distress. What do? Then the issues of debt restructuring, debt reprofiling, debt relief, debt write-off, all those areas come into picture, and that's the second stage of working. Third, and more importantly, interestingly, to your original question, how do you reduce the cost of borrowing over time for countries? Japan, again, despite having 20-260% of debt to GDP ratio, can borrow less than 1%. Countries like Pakistan, with 60%, 70% debt, cannot borrow in single digits in the international market. Why? Of course, structure of the economy is different, financial market is different, but it leads to lessons to be learned. Aam lafz hum kehte hain, yaar, what is Japan doing that other countries are not? How can be Japan? So we are able to raise financing so that we can invest in SDGs at low cost, because at double-digit interest rates is simply not going to be feasible. The return is not going to be high enough to compensate for the cost of borrowing. So that's the third area where how do you reduce the cost of borrowing over time, and how do you increase access to concessional financing for developing countries. Access to concessional financing has, of course, linkages with what we were talking before we started the conversation. International financial architecture reforms. MDB's role, how can they increase lending and on favorable terms and for long term, and more importantly, those areas that are linked directly with sustainable development.
Yeah.
So that's the picture.
Yeah. I remember I mean, I remember when the Pakistan's debt was reprofiled write-off for 15 years in
Early 2000s.
2000.
Early 2000s.
US write off their bilateral debt of $2 billion US, and for that they demanded from the charge from the Senate, from their treasury, only $200 million, because according to the current financing system, it was only that much. So obviously
there are other examples. They call it
very important
HIPC initiative, Highly Indebted Poor Countries initiative, which was undertaken in the 90s. Helped a lot. Jubilee movement, they call it. There have been efforts, Ready Plan in 1980s. So there have been examples globally. What is missing is a structured approach.
What should we do now?
होता ये कि जब आप debt पे हल तलाश तब करते हैं जब already मसला शुरू हो जाता है.
अब क्या? I'm asking for a very generic and very, very important reason actually, because I personally understand that it has become a political issue than domestic.
It always is.
And now it's a stage, it is a social issue.
It always is in many senses.
No,
yes.
To the extent that it can cause social unrest.
Yes, we are on the brink of it, unfortunately, in my assessment. Again, a very good question. See, multi-pronged strategy has to be done. So just to make sure we continue with the conversation. So ये 3 areas जो मैंने बताया. How to assess debt. Pakistan में थोड़ी सी और investigation की चाहिए, and we want to collaborate with Pakistan. How to assess debt. मैंने अभी explain किया, assess debt से मुराद है कि जो assessment approach आपकी investment requirements को incorporate करके बताए कि जनाब अब मेरा debt sustainable है या नहीं है, वो पाकिस्तान में work नहीं हुआ. We working with broader numbers, 60% हो जाएगा तो vulnerable है और एक्सेस हर्ट हो जाएगा, हमारी परसेप्शन चेंज हो जाती है, हमारी लैंड कॉस्ट ऑफ बोरिंग बढ़ जाती है, many other considerations. So there is room for improvement there, which allows actually to say, look, if debt is raised in this manner with the financing strategy, over time, it will pay off. So it's okay if initially debt level is high. That kind of assessment with a longish framework has not been done in many countries, and Pakistan can do that. That's one. Other is Pakistan needs to start talking about debt restructuring. External first, with major bilaterals, and then potentially domestic debt restructuring as well, which is a very tricky and political area. Why? Why am I saying that? Both debt restructuring and need for debt assessment. वो जो आपने कहा social unrest के brink पे हैं. मैं अभी session में मैंने बड़ी frankly कहा था, what good is debt sustainability if people are suffering? What is the... No good. Yes. Of course not. What is the cost country has paid last 30 plus years since early 90s, late 80s, जब से हमारे program है pretty much continuously. What cost the country has paid to stay afloat? Technical default तो हमने नहीं किया, barring late 90s, but overall नहीं किया हमने. We always managed to stay afloat. Debt हमारा is deemed sustainable, but it has come at a heavy cost. We are pretty much continuously the IMF program. ये question नहीं debate हुआ, क्योंकि उसकी social consequences बड़े serious हैं. हम उसको देखते हैं अगर डिफॉल्ट हो गया तो क्या होगा, तो लिहाजा किसी न किसी तरह गिरते पड़ते आईएमएफ के पास जाके बचा लो. वो क्या बचाया हमने? टेक्निकली डेट इज सस्टेनेबल, बट पीपल आर सफरिंग. यूथ in particular are getting disillusioned. So that means
losing their career.
Not just career, they don't see any prospects of life. So that's what you're referring to, social unrest elements there, which is very dangerous. So debt is, like you rightly said, is always been a political issue and increasingly becoming a social issue. Our approach, UN's approach we are proposing is essentially primarily doing that. We're saying don't make it a technical economic issue, look more holistically. You bring in, when I say SDG investment requirement, SDG has concerns of climate change and investment in hunger and food security. I didn't spell out the details, but people know what SDGs are. So this is the second strategy, right? Third is engage with the international community in a very, very structured manner. Political processes हैं उसके. अभी हमने बात की कि existing debt resolution framework नहीं है globally. But पाकिस्तान का या developing countries का as a whole क्या contribution है to try and give shape to those reforms? मैं आपको मिसाल देता हूँ जिस एरिया में हम काम कर रहे हैं. Sri Lanka and then many Pacific Island countries are saying we are suffering partly in terms of our debt position or fiscal position because of climate change. Climate change की वजह से natural disasters बहुत आ रहे हैं, हमें उसको respond करना पड़ता है, हमारी fiscal position खराब होती है, in the process we accumulate debt. लेकिन हमने तो climate change cause ही नहीं किया. Pacific Island का contribution climate change में is negligible, but they are suffering the consequences of that including a rise in debt, including debt. So international community क्या कह रही है? Well, your debt is vulnerable. I'm going to help you out more than 10% of interest rates. They're saying this is not fair. The system needs to be reformed. Secretary General of UN called the international monetary system, financial system, morally bankrupt. Morally bankrupt. Very strong worded statement. Their absolute countries are absolutely right. So they are now working as a group to put pressure on the system. UN is going to hold two major global things. One in 2024, Summit of the Future, where this will be part of conversations. And more importantly, the fourth high-level dialogue on financing for development. The last one was Addis Ababa Action Agenda in 2015. That's going to happen in September 2025. So we tend to work through the political process, backed by technical research-based analysis for these reforms.
There would be other interaction.
उसमें engage होना चाहिए पाकिस्तान को.
There would be some sort of an interaction before that forum happened with the larger community.
Oh, it's already happening. It's continuously happening at the technical level, at the outreach level, at the technical level of the political processes, policy dialogues.
Reaching the population.
Exactly. Policy dialogues, so inviting NGOs, inviting citizens, youth. What do they think? That's already happening across the UN system. We have hosted several already.
Do you think just a mere student, not even student, but a very peripheral
observer.
After the First World War, the Central Powers lost, and the Caliphate was, it was rolled over.
Oh, from the Muslim side.
They devised a system which failed.
League of Nations.
There was another war. They thought that there must have been something wrong, which has happened. So they brought in this international rule-based system on four major principles.
Yes.
Do you think that rule, after everything else, now it is failing or it has failed?
I have news for you. It failed in 71 already. What you're referring is the Bretton Woods system. Monetary financial system की domain में अगर आप बात करें.
And international rule-based system under UNESCAP.
Exactly. As a whole, trade की उसमें और elements भी थे. But अगर हम zero in करें अपने topic debt के हवाले से, monetary system के हवाले से, financial system के हवाले से, तो Bretton Woods system arrange हुआ. तो आम लफ्जों में वो क्या था? The price of US dollar was fixed against the dollar, 35 ounce per dollar, 35 cents per ounce. And the rest of the currencies were pegged against the US dollar.
Yeah.
And that was functioning fine in 50s and 60s because when the model was conceived, US was a surplus country. They were essentially lenders, not borrowers.
Yeah.
Things changed in 50s and 60s because US went on a fiscal expansionary mode, building the infrastructure, the highways and everything. They started running deficits, which means they needed to borrow, which means the demand for dollars suddenly went up, but price was fixed. So there was a lot of outflow of dollars from the US. So there was a lot of pressure. So long story short, Richard Nixon, the then president of US, pulled it out unilaterally, August 9th, 71, of the system. Breaking system was no more. Again, in Aam Zuban mein,
so it was
plain
not
words.
Against gold.
Exactly. Currencies were let go and they were floating in the market. ये floating exchange rate system कोई thought through करके create नहीं किया. It was the result of a breakdown of an existing international order. उसके बाद से अभी तक there has no formal monetary system in place. It's a de facto fixed market-oriented flexible exchange rate system because there's no other formal system has been put in place. ये मैं 1970 से बता रहा हूँ आपको. So और मैं अगर एंगल से बात करूँ तो the international system is outdated. That's what reform means. It needs to be updated. It needs to be brought to the 21st century. Politically अगर बात करें, that system was created by the victors of the World War II. हम उनकी बनाई.
You're quoting Hitler.
No, I don't know about Hitler said that. I hope I'm not. I'm saying the world
was written by the victors.
Well, maybe he meant in a different context. I'm meaning in a different sense. The international system was created by those who won the war.
Yeah.
So it's their world, it's their rules. Security Council में veto vote है, P5 जो है, ये उनका बनाया हुआ.
Yeah, absolutely.
तो developing countries, और आपको factual बताता हूँ बात. I think if I'm not wrong, before World War II started, there were only 39 countries in the world.
Yeah.
हम developing countries exist ही नहीं करते थे. They were empires. Nation state का concept was just starting. अब 193 से ऊपर मुल्क हैं, कम से कम मेंबर हैं, 200 से प्लस अगर आप टेरिटरीज वगैरह डाल लेते हैं, तो दुनिया बदल गई है. तो ये जो सिस्टम ग्लोबल बना था, इसमें तो हम शामिल नहीं थे इस कॉन्वर्सेशन में कि क्या होना चाहिए क्या नहीं होना चाहिए. वो तो विक्टर्स ने बना दी, हम उनकी दुनिया बनाई दुनिया में रहते हैं. तो जो UN is pushing now is essentially saying, look, enough time has passed, these countries are reality, they exist. Let's hear their concerns, let's bring their elements in the international monetary system. But it's not going to be easy, of course, right? Because that has serious implications on losing global political influence once you revisit that. So these are fascinating and extremely interesting debates.
It's fascinating, and I don't want to stop here. We can keep on talking, but I think we should talk in
part 2.
Part 2, the modular approach to selecting topic. But it's very necessary because, you know, I quote very often one person nowadays, but that is so. The author of The Sapien.
Oh, Hariri.
Hariri. He said somewhere. He said when the angel told that you are the one, they said, "Do you lying?" But when the people started believing, it became religion. He said the fiction takes you ahead. It's not the fact, and that fiction is your narrative. So it's important that it should not be, that narrative should be built on a story which is a true story as well, based on research and everything.
मैं छोटी सी बात करके इस पे कंक्लूड करते हैं. बड़ी मजेदार आपने मिसाल दी. इस पे बड़ा फॉर्मल काम किया इकोनॉमिस्ट ने. There is a book called Narrative Economics by Robert Shiller. So it's a formal काम हो चुका है उसके ऊपर, bringing in psychological insights into economics. Humans think in storytelling. They always, right? That's what Yuval Harari is also saying. Sometimes some narratives become so powerful, people think they're reality. मैं आपको बहुत सिंपल दो मिसाल,
even though they're not.
Even they're not. दो बेसिक मिसालें. ये जेब में जो करेंसी का टुकड़ा है, ये नैरेटिव है. उस कागज टुकड़े पे लिखा हुआ है 5,000. उसकी कोई कीमत नहीं है, लेकिन इतना पावरफुल नैरेटिव है कि इसकी कीमत 5,000 है. हुकूमत जिम्मेदारी दे रही है कि इसकी कीमत 5,000 है. Everybody buys into that कि ये 5,000 का कागज का टुकड़ा है. वो रियलिटी बन गई है. If you think about it, it's not. मैं आपको और मिसाल देता हूँ. Nation states. There's a book, author का नाम मुझे भूल गया. Imagine Communities, something Atkinson, I think. Imagine Communities. Nation states narrative है essentially. हमने narrative बनाया. Geographically, physically, physical reality में नहीं टच करते हैं. आपकी अगर आंखों में पट्टी बंद करके मैं आपको पाकिस्तान इंडिया के या पाकिस्तान अफगानिस्तान के किसी भी बॉर्डर पे खड़ा कर दूं और पट्टी खोलूंगा ये इंडिया या पाकिस्तान है, आप नहीं बता सकते. Geography उस पर्टिकुलर पॉइंट पे इज गोना बी सो सिमिलर, यू वोंट नो, अस्यूमिंग कि कोई बार्ब वायर वगैरह नहीं लगी हुई, राइट? लेकिन वो इतना स्ट्रॉन्ग नैरेटिव डेवलप होता है पॉलिटिकली, उसके सिंबल्स क्रिएट होते हैं, नेशनल एंथम, फ्लैग, करेंसी, उसके पूरे एक्सेस होती है. It's nothing wrong with that. I'm not saying right or wrwrong. I'm simply saying power of narrative is amazing. तो हमारी लास्ट में भी गुफ्तगू मुझे याद पड़ता है इसी पे बात पे हुई थी, खत्म हुई थी, इसलिए मैं इस वक्त इसी पे खत्म करना चाह रहा था कि let's not underestimate the power of narratives. UN right now is working essentially, that's what I believe, and I'm part of that team, is trying to build a counter narrative to the mainstream thinking, to the mainstream institutions that we believe are not ready or not optimal, not functioning fully, not fully supporting the aspirations of the citizens of this world. Usko reforms कह लें आप, जो मर्जी कह लें, but that needs to be revisited. That narrative has to change now. It is nudged a little bit, but not changed fully.
Yeah.
The conversation needs to continue.
Thank you very much for sparing so much time. But I think
not a problem.
In the interest of our audience, we should continue this.
I'll try my best.
Time and again. So with this, we come to an end. No more summing up. Watch the whole program. I want you to watch the whole program. It's very interesting. Goodbye for now.